All right. Hello, everyone, and good morning. We'll get started. So thanks to you all for joining us and for making your way from the plenary and choosing to be here at this session to Trust Again, Rebuilding Resilient and Authentic Democratic Institutions. My name is Veronika Bylicki, and I'll be moderating over this next hour and a bit. And before I introduce myself for panelists and frame our time together, I wanted to speak where I'm joining from. So I'm joining in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'm deeply grateful to call these lands my home as a first-generation settler, and to me, conversations about democracy and trust, and in the work that I do in city building and engagement, can't happen without acknowledging the stewardship of these lands by our host nations and Indigenous peoples, millennia before we came to build these systems, which are at the center of this week's conversation. And to me, this also means recognizing the presence of these nations and Indigenous peoples today, and that doing this work on these territories has to center and uplift Indigenous voices. And I'd like to invite everyone here to share which territories you're joining in the chat, if you can. And before we go any further, I'd also like to share a few housekeeping notes. Please note that the session is being recorded and will be distributed after Democracy Exchange to participants, and only the speakers will be visible in the video. We welcome your engagement all the way throughout the conversation. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you can use to send questions to the speakers, and we'll do our best to address the questions with the time allotted, but we'll have a lot to get through. And there's also a chat box on the right, which allows you to interact with other summit participants, and our chat moderator will provide helpful links and additional content throughout the session. And if you need any tech help or any other help throughout the summit, please contact summit@democracyexchange.org, or you can visit the help desk located in the festival tab on your screen. Okay, and so to dive into things, like I said, my name is Veronika Bylicki, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour and a bit, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. As I mentioned, I'm joining in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, which means that yes, you're doing the math correctly. It's 6:30 in the morning for me, and as I'm sure many of you can relate, there's nothing else that I'd rather be doing before the sun rises on a Thursday morning than talking about trust in our civic institutions here with you all. And I'm the executive director and co-founder of CityHive. We're a nonprofit organization based in Metro Vancouver, and our mission is to transform the way that young people are engaged in shaping their cities, in civic processes, and in decision making. A big chunk of our work is working directly with municipal governments, different levels of government and institutions to transform the way that they engage youth. And we also run a number of hands-on civic education programs to build the capacity of youth to understand our civic system and to be directly engaged. And CityHive came to exist because we didn't see youth in decision-making spaces, be it at community open houses, at the voting booth, at city council, or in being represented or centered on the floors of legislatures and parliaments. Youth were and continue to be missing at the table. And when we first founded CityHive just over 4 years ago, the barriers and gaps that we honed in on were a lack of meaningful opportunities for engagement, a lack of civic education, ageism and tokenism, and structural and systemic barriers based on gender, race, and class, among many other things. And so much of what we focus on before we could even name it or before we knew it is all about trust. And whether it was the young person who couldn't find the front door to their local city hall when they wanted to speak at a city council meeting, whether it was the young person who voted for the first time and didn't see themselves or their key issues spoken for, or the young person who was on a youth council and felt tokenized for their identity. These are just a few examples, but trust exists, trust is lost, and trust is built across many playing fields. And when it comes to our democracy, trust is one of the elements required for resilience in our public institutions. If trust is weak, we can lose out on the capacities of people who our institutions represent and who breathe life into our institutions. If it's too strong, the democratic foundations we value can quickly erode as a result of excessive deference to these institutions. And so over the next hour, we'll be doing a deep dive into trust, what research is telling us about trends in trust across Canada before and during the pandemic, lessons and stories from the playing field, both from the perspectives of institutions and citizens, what trust is good for, and ultimately, what should we be striving for in our democratic institutions and civic organizations. And we have a stellar set of panelists joining us to paint a full picture. And we'll start with some opening reflections from each of our panelists, then dive into questions and conversation, and then we'll finish off with Q&A from the audience. And so in the meantime, as you're hearing from the panelists, please continue to use the chat function and the Q&A box so we can make sure that we get to your questions. And so I'll introduce each of our panelists as they give their opening remarks. I won't be sharing their full, very impressive and incredible bios, but you can find those on the site. And so first, I'll be introducing David. David Coletto is the CEO and founding partner of Abacus Data, a full-service market research and strategy firm based in Ottawa. With over a decade of experience in the industry, David and his partners founded Abacus 10 years ago, and since then, it has grown into one of Canada's most respected market research firms. And so, David, I'll hand it off to you to open up and share how the theme of trust in democratic institutions shows up in your work.
Well, great. Thanks, Veronika, and pleasure to be here. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try to share my screen. We're going to see if this works because I'm a researcher who needs slides to show off his data. And as Veronika said, you know, I've been asked to come and share some of the research we've been doing over the last number of months, looking at how Canadians have responded to the way in which they perceive public institutions, democratic institutions responding to the crisis that we're all living in. And I want to first acknowledge, you know, the Rideau Hall Foundation, one of our clients, a great organization based in Ottawa that sponsored much of the data that I'll share with you. And we released this back in June. I was able to do another wave of research. So I'm going to present to you three waves. We did a survey in February 2020 before, you know, the pandemic really came to Canada and sort of put us into a lockdown. And so we had this almost experiment where we had data right before the pandemic. We did another survey in May, in the middle, or I guess now really the beginning of it. And I went back in the field in September and did another survey. And so I just want to share just a snapshot of some of the results and really think about the question, how has the pandemic impacted attitudes towards our lives and these broader systems, in particular our democratic system? The first is that we have noticed across the board an improvement. And we've seen this in other surveys. And I think this theme about whether, you know, increased trust in democratic institutions in Canada is going to persist, or whether this is a short-term blip in response to the pandemic. To me, that is the big question. And what we've seen is when it comes to the way the economy works, when it comes to the broader political system in Canada, back in February, 2/3 of Canadians felt that both the economy and the broader political system were headed in the wrong direction. Now, today or last month in September, that number is still, I think, too high for any of us to feel comfortable with, but it is down, particularly views on the political system. You saw a big, over 20 percentage point swing from February to May. So in the midst of the pandemic, Canadians were feeling far better about the direction of the political system. We can talk about why that might be. I think one of them is the system seemed to be cooperating, working together, different levels of government, institutions, keeping us relatively safe and responsive to what we were going through. When it comes to people's own life, one of the ironies in a way of this pandemic, despite the negative impact it's had on so many people, both socially, economically, and from a health perspective, is that actually, as of September, a larger number of people described their own life headed in the right direction than they did back in February. So still 1 out of 5 Canadians feel that their life is not headed in the right direction, but that's up a statistically significant number over the course of those months. And it's held, and you can see from May to September. So despite this pandemic, we're feeling generally a little bit better about the direction of our lives. And I can speak to that in our conversation. When we look at how the views on the political system, is it headed in the right direction or the wrong direction across the region? we do see some variation. Where Veronika is in British Columbia, generally slightly higher views back in September about the direction of the political system in Canada. Cross the border over the Rockies and you have a very different view. And some of that is driven by economic situation, some of it is political. Not surprising, those who vote Liberal feel much better about the political system than those who vote Conservative, with New Democrats and Green and Bloc supporters kind of in the middle. But outside of Western Canada, we see fairly consistent numbers in Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and in the prairies. About half feel good about the direction of the political system in September, and half feel bad. Now, one of the things we explored is how well do Canadians think our institutions responded to the pandemic? And what we actually find is a broad positive view that our system either responded well, 45% say very well or well. Now that's down slightly since May. 44% say it responded as well as can be expected. Only 11% gave our political system and the public institutions that are within it poor marks. In fact, that too is down 3 points. So Canadians have moved kind of into the middle, saying, I'm not ready to give, A's and A pluses, but I'm not willing to fail our system either. And so there's been a general sense of I think, a positive reaction so far to how our institutions have reacted. Now, in fact, public institutions have remained resilient. One of the things we did in that survey with the Rito Hall Foundation is we asked people how well do these different components look after your interests. So Parliament, 63% in February said it's doing either well or acceptably in looking out for your interests. That's up 6 points. Provincial legislatures, we saw a 15 percentage point increase from February to September. Our financial and banking system, 3/4, give relatively good marks. Our healthcare system saw a boost. So all of these institutions within our system are generally viewed more positively today than they were back in February. And some were stronger than others as a starting point. So what can we learn from this? The first is the evidence that I see in our research is crises like this pandemic cause us to pay more attention to our democratic system. This is the moment to be having this conversation and to be asking Canadians to reflect on the system itself. But it also causes us to assess that system, right? And we can't help but force comparisons with others. Being so close to, by all accounts, a country that has largely failed to adequately respond to the crisis has created, I think, an inflated sense of how good our institutions are. So just as an example, when we ask Canadians, do you think Canada generally is headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? And then we ask the same question about the United States. This is the trend line for right direction. You can see we feel better about our own country relative compared to what's going on in the United States. That gap has grown since the pandemic has started, and is sort of we're coming farther down, and the United States is holding pretty steady. Only 10% of Canadians in our most recent survey think that country's headed in the right direction. When we ask Canadians in February, are public institutions in Canada better, worse, or no better or worse than those in other countries? You can see that, before the pandemic, Mexico, Brazil, United States, even many of us thought we were better. The UK, for example, most of us thought we were no better, no worse. But what we have learned and seen is that the pandemic has reinforced and shifted people's views. So there's been a 9-point increase in those who say that we are better than the United States, our institutions, our democratic system, 6-point increase than Brazil, and a 4-point increase than Italy. The others haven't changed. That's an indication that, information about how the pandemic is faring in those countries has affected our interpretation. So will our democracy remain resilient? Big question that I think we're going to have to ask ourselves, because we have seen this boost. I'm not convinced it's going to last, that I think it will come back down to where it was. And so that original question about trust in institutions requires us to continue to have that conversation, especially as the economic impact and social impact of the pandemic, I think, starts to deteriorate people's trust in the long term in these institutions. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Those are really fascinating trends, and we'll be coming back for sure to some of those questions about what that means for this moment and what that means for us and our democratic institutions. And next, I'll be handing it off to Tiffany Gooch to share her opening remarks. And Tiffany, part Politico and part creative, Tiffany is a skilled consensus builder and storyteller. Her work centers on public affairs campaigns and crisis communications. Tiffany brings a wealth of experience to her clients, having worked in numerous roles advising provincial ministers, MPPs, and the Premier of Ontario. Since leaving government, she has consulted across multiple sectors spanning post-secondary education, technology and innovation, finance, government agency, agriculture, healthcare, skilled trades, and culture. Handing it off to you, Tiffany.
Thank you. Good morning. And so happy to be here today, and very thrilled that we're having this conversation, because I think it's quite important. I think that the first piece that I think is important is coming from a crisis communications perspective, is that trust has to be built before we're in crisis. That's so important. And so I think with any clients that I've ever worked with, there's this important piece around ensuring that that you've gone through the work to build trust ahead of that moment that it's most needed. And so I like to sort of approach this from 4 different perspectives. And so the first is your relationship with media. And so I think oftentimes with government, we'll have sort of distrustful relationships back and forth with media. And so it's also quite important that that government leaders are taking an approach of trust with their media partners. And I like to use the example of Minister Chrystia Freeland and her approach to media. Having come from a media background, she's definitely the type to have that mutual respect. And we saw very clearly with the renegotiation of NAFTA, a space where she was always making sure there was accessibility to media and ensuring that she was answering questions and making herself available along the way, although most of those negotiations needed to remain private, at the negotiating table, but ensuring she was taking that face-to-face time with the specific stakeholders that were impacted and the communities that were very seriously impacted. I'm from Windsor, so I think of it, from that perspective as well. That face-to-face time really mattered, but also the ability to sort of see media apparatus as a partner and communicating to the public is important. I'd say secondly, very important for government, we start with the campaign, we start with the platform, and then we sort of end up in government, and the question becomes, what is the actual plan so that people can follow along on what that plan happens to be? And so I think for some governments, some have been a little bit more forthcoming. We've seen in the past few years more accessibility to mandate letters for ministers and how the internal plans are being communicated to outside folks who are interested in following along. But there's absolutely, interested parties that are creating their own trackers to follow along on how government is moving along on the plans that they set for themselves. Of course, again, in a pandemic with a major crisis that's taking place, there's always forgiveness when, some of those plans are thrown off track slightly. But knowing what those plans are and being able to follow along on them, I think is always quite important. Third, all institutions, not just government, always start in a trust deficit place, right? Folks trust people. It's people that are able to gain trust. So important to remember that institutions are made up of people. And so I often, try to remind folks that those that are leading specific files and leading in government apparatus had a past before they held that portfolio, before they were doing that work. And so if before they held that role, they hadn't been able to build trust with those stakeholders, or perhaps they had, a stronger relationship with one side than another, or donors or things along those lines, that also plays a role in how people are able to trust how they're moving forward and what they're doing. And so quite important for, the makeup of a cabinet and the makeup of a team that might be responding to crisis to have built that trust ahead of time in their careers. And finally, and I think this is a quite important piece, and I use it as a guiding principle in politics myself, is I use the quote, You can't make the other fellow feel important in your presence if secretly you think that they're a nobody. And so government is always communicating to multiple audiences. So the question becomes, which of those audiences matter to them? Which of those audiences are they really trying to bring along? Which ones are they just neutralizing? Which ones have they completely forgotten about and aren't communicating to directly? And so, of course, through a pandemic, we're not able to have these in-person opportunities in the same way. But while they're, in this space where we have to use new ways of communicating, new ways of connecting, we're not able to look each other in the eye the same way. How are they, going above and beyond to make sure that they're connecting with audiences that might not be coming to them, but are still impacted in very real ways of the work that they're doing? And so I'll leave it at that for now, but really think it's important to sort of see it from each of these four perspectives.
Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks for laying out those four perspectives and laying it out so clearly in terms of how we can be looking at and framing trust and our civic institutions. Next, I'll be handing it off to Mike. And Mike Morden joined the Samara Centre in 2017 from the Moffa Centre, a public policy think tank at the University of Toronto. Previously, he was a postdoctoral research fellow in Canadian politics at Western and Wilfrid Laurier Universities, a senior policy advisor in the government of Ontario, and a research associate with the Mosaic Institute. He loves producing new evidence and linking knowledge to concrete action. Mike, off to you.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Veronika, and to the other panelists. Great to join this conversation. I'm really happy with how it's been framed already, because what I wanted to start off by saying is I'm not convinced that we have a big trust problem in Canada. We tend to assume that that's the case. And I think there's a few reasons why we're led to believe we're in a uniquely distrusting moment. One is that there are some groups in society that have systematic distrust of Canadian institutions, and that's quite rational and well-earned. And that's not new. Those groups have simply, carved out more space on the main stage of Canadian political life. Another is that more broadly and in the aggregate, we have a changed communications landscape, which leads us to believe we've reached a low ebb of satisfaction in our democracy. Social media, above all else, consists of platforms that are engineered to amplify big negative emotions that leave us with a skewed perception of the mindset of Canadians. It was also true that there was a long process from the 1960s when we started measuring, where trust and satisfaction in institutions declined, and there was a point at which it just sort of felt like that would always be the case. It would just keep declining. And then we're also, as David alluded to, always haunted by the experience of the United States of America, where it's pretty clear that political trust has collapsed in a condition of extreme polarization. And all of those factors lead us to broadly accept a narrative, which I just don't think is totally right. The Samara Centre has been tracking attitudes of Canadians towards their democracy for, not quite a decade. And in that time, they've become markedly more positive, notably more positive, more trust, more satisfaction. And it's not evenly distributed across the country, every demographic or political community, but it's surprisingly well distributed. The trend is pretty constant, even if the magnitude varies quite a bit. And you can look back over the course of decades, some questions that have been asked over and over again, and you see that, it's not clear that we're on a downward trajectory. And as David set out, trust is absolutely peaking in 2020. I was very glad that the conversation was framed that way, despite the fact of David scooping and some upcoming Samara research. But we've done the same thing. We looked at how Canadians have expressed their democratic attitudes just before the pandemic arrived and just after. And simply put, in the hardest year in living memory, Canadians are more satisfied with their democracy. They're less likely to sign on to populist notions. Everyone, the elites are corrupt. We should be led by the ordinary people. In different ways we measure populism have basically all declined. They're more confident in their leadership. And one of the findings that really jumped out at me is we're actually less nostalgic for some imagined golden age. A big part of cynicism is believing that there was a time when it wasn't like this. And oddly enough, in 2020, which is, for most people, probably the most challenging year, maybe not personally, but broadly that we've experienced, we're much less likely to say, yeah, governments used to know how to do this. So that's sort of paradoxical and fascinating to me, that in this moment we've reached highs of trust and satisfaction. It might not be lasting. I agree. It might be just a moment in time. But nevertheless, it's, I also think, not totally inconsistent with some trends that we've seen over the course of several years. So I think the idea of a decline in trust deserves some scrutiny. What we have is some pockets of distrust, which are very well founded. We have small pockets of distrust, which are more a function of ideology, hardcore populists, for example, who are simply very small in number in Canada and often amplified out of all proportion by social media, by traditional media too. And we have an overall Canadian public, which is about as generally satisfied with our democracy as we've been while these sorts of things have been tracked by public opinion research. So what? Is maybe the question. And I think the decline of trust narrative creates some problems for us. For one thing, it pollutes our political leadership, who absolutely, in my experience, believe it. Our politicians, our political elites are in some ways more populist than the people are. And it causes them to degrade institutions and to be afraid to ask Canadians to participate in nation building, to put skin in the game, to do hard work, to build a better society. I think what Canadians have demonstrated in 2020 is they can be asked to do really hard things and they won't necessarily resent it. And I think because we perceive this state of distrust, political leaders are less likely to really ask something of the Canadian public, whether that's to pay for a more equitable, robust recovery or to mobilize in civil society, or whatever. I also think, and this is a related point, that the narrative distracts from the more compelling trust problem in our democracy, which is the unwillingness of political leaders to trust the Canadian public, to let us in the mistaken belief that we're this angry horde. Just to return very briefly, Veronika, to the experience you outlined in how you are organized in your community, we often have this sense of young people, for example, as being particularly distrusting, and that just doesn't show up in the research at all. They're actually more likely than older people to see their political leaders as capable of good ethical decisions. But what did you identify, Veronika? Structural obstacles to participation, tokenism. So who's failing to trust whom? In this case, it's institutions and leaders failing to trust the Canadian public. And my sincere hope is that in the COVID recovery, when we get to it, that will become a watershed in sophisticated mass public participation. But that requires more than an act of trust on the part of the Canadian public. It requires an act of trust on the part of our leadership to trust us to be central to designing what comes next. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for extending the way that we've been talking about trust, in that I think trust at any relational level is a two-way street. And we're not just talking about the trust that Canadians have in our civic institutions, but we're talking about the way that that trust is also reciprocated or not reciprocated. And before we jump into questions, we have one more panelist with her opening remarks. And so next we have Brittany Andrew-Amofah. And Brittany is the Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Broadbent Institute, where she is responsible for setting the research and policy direction of the organization and managing the Broadbent Institute's fellow program. She also provides regular political commentary to CBC News and others. Brittany's work focuses on bridging the world of policy, politics, and social justice. She works to provide accessible political information that enables others to feel motivated and empowered to become involved in the political process. Her primary focus is on engaging those who've been excluded and disenfranchised from the Canadian political system due to systemic racism, colonization, and the concentration of power. She actively works to challenge these systems in order to create a better, more social democratic society. Brittany, off to you.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. And I just want to say thank you to Samara for inviting me here today, as well as for Democracy Exchange. Thank you. So first of all, my fellow panelists really laid out what I would think, what conversations exist currently right now as it relates to trust or institutions, democracy, etc. And when I was listening to David's presentation, the thing that came to my mind when he was sharing his research was the conversation that I often have around apathy, and the conversation around our democratic deficit. And as David has brilliantly kind of laid out, we're seeing that Canadians are trusting our institutions even more as we're in a crisis than they would have when we weren't in a crisis. So we're really seeing how moments of crises or moments where Canadians really need to rely on their institutions to help them through their day-to-day lives, their institutions to provide financial support or relief, or even their institutions to help them provide that sense of support or solidarity, really I guess comes to fruition or matters the most during moments when Canadians are looking for some sort of help or in a crisis situation. And that makes me think that a lack of trust in institutions sometimes is often conflated with a lack of democratic action or even participation. And I kind of want to kind of explain that a little bit more. And when I think about that, or when we're talking about that, is that we often know in countries around the world where there are unstable democracies, or where government isn't always seen as the go-to when people need help, we see in those countries that voter participation rates are often quite high. That elections are often ones where people really gather around. Elections are moments where people feel that their say matters the most, and that our elections can really determine really great outcomes for folks in countries where their democracies are quite unstable. But when we go to democracies like in the West, in Canada, and we know that the U.S. has changed quite significantly with this presidency. But I would say predominantly in the West, we do see that different relationship around voting and elections, not to be seen as we are coming out to save our country or we're coming out to really cast our vote, but seeing something that's kind of something that falls by the wayside, or an action that doesn't really necessarily require sometimes a lot of thought. And this is why, for many federal elections, our voter participation rates have hovered around 60%. In Toronto, we see voter participation rates around 40%. And that is cause for concern for people like me who are very much interested in getting people out to vote, getting people to see that, casting their vote is important and can determine a lot of different things as it relates to policy outcomes. But then that also leads others or me to think, and people are really invested in this work, to think that voting sometimes doesn't mean as much because there's so much trust in our institutions, that regardless of who's in power, not much is actually going to change, or regardless of the outcome of the election, things could, for better or less, stay the course. We can still rely on our healthcare system to do what it needs to do for the most part, or we can rely on our political representatives to show up to work and cast their votes in a way that they're intended or supposed to do. So our governance models really, I would say, lays a firm foundation for trust to exist within our political realm, but for our other institutions, whether it's our education institutions, healthcare institutions, social service institutions, to really follow that lead as well. But when I also thinking about in what informs my work at the Institute, but also what informs the work overall, when it comes to ensuring that people maintain their trust, and what we've seen has, been somewhat shaky, but it's been operating better or less during this pandemic, is the fact that good access to good information is essential. So, throughout this pandemic, we've seen all different levels of government really kind of work together to relay information and to ensure that the public is up to speed on what is being asked of them, but also what is being offered or provided to them as a source of relief and as a source of support. But also when we're thinking about trust, it's really, really critical and important in order for us to maintain it, is for people to increasingly see themselves reflected in those who are making the decisions. So representation is always really key. We talk about representation a lot, especially as it relates to people of color, indigenous peoples, racialized peoples across this country, but also for representation to not be tokenized. So for trust to really be amplified and for it to be taken to another level as it relates to the public really feeling a sense of investment in our institutions, we need to get to a place where, you know, there's a good old stat out there where 30% of representatives as it relates to women is when we can start to see mass change, is when we start to move past the 1 or 2 or 3 as it relates to a specific identity and really see those individuals as a permanent piece of the fabric that exists within our institutions. And then also, in order for trust to remain and for trust to again be strengthened, it's really, really important that the public feels a sense of fairness, that people don't feel as if the powerful or the rich or those who have access to all the resources are gaming the system. And I think that has been really key to look out for throughout this pandemic, as we see people who may have access to resources or wealth or a variety of other means may be benefiting or getting access to different benefits in society. I immediately think about a conversation that was taking place a few weeks ago as it relates to the Canada-US border, and why certain individuals were allowed into Canada without having to prove or determine if, you know, they had access Canada to the US, without having to prove if they had COVID or if there was any COVID tests, etc. But anyways, this was leaked out into the news, and it really, I guess, tests whether people have faith in whether the government is handling our border in a way that I would say is in the best needs or is in the best interest of Canadians, right? So it's really important that we are not allowing those to game the system, that there's an element of fairness, that everybody, regardless of who you are, has some form of relatively same access to the institutions that exist. Another problem that is currently arising is access to tests, whether that is COVID screening tests, access to testing centers, and the rise, I would say, of private testing centers to, I would say, skip the line as it relates to the public testing centers that exist. And when we start to see that other folks can have access to some of the benefits of society that helps to keep them safe or helps to keep their friends or family safe, that's when we start to see an erosion of trust. So that also speaks to some of David's, what I would say, research is when we do start to see the economy maybe start to downturn, or if we do start to see some of our testing capacities or abilities in different provinces not maybe living up to what was their intention, or maybe if we do start to see some financial supports and income supports not really providing the sense of relief for folks, that's when we can start to maybe see whether trust really remains for folks as high as it currently does as it relates to this current pandemic. And lastly, Tiffany touched on this earlier on when she was speaking about trust, is that trust needs to be built prior to anything that occurs, whether it's a crisis, whether it's a moment where you're accessing supports, whether it's a moment where you're even interacting with the service that exists. Trust needs to be built, and relationships are the foundation of that. So if people do not have a relationship prior to interacting with an institution, as Tiffany had brilliantly laid it out, they're already operating from a trust deficit. So I am constantly thinking through the questions around, will our democracy remain resilient as we move throughout this pandemic? It would be very fascinating to know or to see how an election would actually operate in this moment in time. If we would see a dramatic rise in voter participation rates because people are noticing that the institutions that make up society are ones that we so desperately rely on in order to get us through a crisis. That would be a really interesting way to measure trust in institutions, but also the correlation between trust and democratic participation as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brittany, for laying that out really well. And I think that you also included quite a few examples of what trust looks like in action and also what it doesn't look like in action. And I think you've posed a really great question about what that looks like going forward for the resilience of our institutions. And as we move into conversation, I want to pick up on one of the threads that you brought up, which is around what happens in countries, what we're seeing in countries with unstable or weaker democracies. And I think we kind of entered this conversation with the assumption that trust is a good thing. And so I want to ask, what is trust good for? And when we're talking about levels of trust, are we talking about the level, or are we talking about a binary of either trusting or not trusting? And how do we know if we have the right amount of trust? And so for that, maybe I'll pass it along to you, Mike, to get us started, and then anybody who could join in.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I think that's a really great question. We tend to assume that trust is an ambiguously good thing. I think we need a measure of trust. I mean, it's hard to draw a line, but so what does trust do? It facilitates collective action. I'm willing to put my part in because I know that you'll do the same, right? In a condition of zero trust, everyone's defaulting, everyone's sort of looking after themselves. So I think trust is an essential ingredient in having any kind of a operating community, just as it is in any kind of interpersonal relationship. Really hard to have a good working relationship with someone you trust zero, you know. And by the same token, it's hard for governments to accomplish really anything if they don't have even a modicum of trust from the people. I think you need a fairly good level of trust. You know, every process isn't going to be out in the open. You need people to buy into the notion that everything they can't see isn't necessarily a kind of like a corrupt act. And you need people to trust that when they pay their tax bill, it's going to do something like reasonably necessary. So I think trust is essential for that reason. It facilitates collective action, but too much trust could clearly be a problem too. I mean, you could see that in an interpersonal relationship as well. If you trust someone absolutely, you stop looking for any kind of accountability or transparency, and then you can be taken advantage of. And so, in looking at the trust numbers in the pandemic, I was in some ways heartened because I think they reflect social cohesion, solidarity, and a commitment to a collective project. But I also thought we better make sure our democratic institutions are functioning, because in a condition of absolute trust, it's kind of a blank check for governments and leaders to act however they want. So I think it's great that the public is trusting, but we better have those institutions. These are good, well-designed, in the broad strokes, well-designed things. We have an official opposition to find fault in the government as their job, and that's important when we're feeling generally fairly positive about the state of things. So yeah, I think too much trust can be a problem too, and that's why we need institutions, intermediaries like media, and people sort of dedicated to finding fault, because that's where you find a working democratic balance.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on what trust is good for and what the right level of trust is?
Sure, I'll jump in here. I think Mike really nailed it here, but I'll add sort of when it comes to this absolute trust space, you end up, I think, first of all, with governments that are more willing to move quickly because they think that they have the trust and aren't willing to have proper consultation, or they move through the motions in consultation rather than ensuring that they're taking back the best information possible. And I like to sort of tell the story that I remember when working in government, I often had this perspective of, I'm not really sure if all of these stakeholders understand all of the pressures we're under in this decision, but we're just going to do our best. And then once on the other side of the curtain sort of saw and was like, I'm really not sure if this policy team fully understands the minute impacts that this policy is now going to make on this specific industry and this specific space. Have they taken all of these different things into consideration? And I think that what folks, what activists, what those experts on the outside bring to these conversations can always improve our policy direction. And when we have this space where government feels like it has a mandate to move and move quickly because there's a trust level that is sort of overreached on the balance side, we end up likely with just not the best policy decisions, and ones that could have been improved with proper consultation and more folks involved. And so I think that that's sort of the risk that we end up with of governments that are sort of moving very, very quickly, and again, not taking everything into consideration to get the best out of what they're working toward.
Yeah, thanks both. And if we, building off of what you just shared, Tiffany, if we flip that and we ask what sort of behaviors are trust-inducing, and what do trustworthy democratic institutions look like in practice, and would anyone be able to provide any recommendations for how institutions can gain the public's trust, and what to do when they have with it?
I'll just start. I think one of the reasons why we've seen, in some of the data that I shared and Mike has shared, why we've seen this spike in trust or satisfaction or a sense that institutions are looking out for people is because at the core of trust is doing what you say you're going to do, right? And I think for a large part of this pandemic, Canadian political and public institutions have generally delivered on what they said they were going to do, right? That they moved quickly to put in an emergency benefit program that shocked anyone who knows how bureaucracies work, but they did it, and they proved that government can be effective. It can solve problems for people. And so I think that's at the core of what, a trustful institution looks like, or how it behaves. But over time, to me, it feels that it has to continue to deliver. And that's where it becomes more challenging, because during a crisis, we had an unprecedented level of cooperation between political leaders across levels of government and across political spectrum, right? That will not persist. It's just not going to happen. And so I think one of the things that we've seen in Canada that's not comparable to the United States, or even in the UK, for example, is a lack of partisanship. Like when I looked at some of the numbers in May and June around how conservative-oriented voters were thinking about Justin Trudeau and how liberal or New Democrat-oriented voters were thinking about Doug Ford, they were remarkably similar, right? And together, those are starting to break apart again. So I think trust is something that only lasts so long. And then to me, there's different dimensions of trust. And, you can trust the federal government versus the provincial government. You can trust individual leaders, and your partisanship or your identities then start to filter those, right? And trust, like Tiffany mentioned, trust in the media as an example, right? For anyone who is on the other side of the Trump world, who's not in it, as I'm not, it is mind-boggling that anyone would trust him. And yet, I don't think Republicans as a group have ever trusted their leader as much as they do today, right? And so you have to ask ourselves, to your question, Veronika, how do you build trust? It often is about breaking trust with others or other groups or others. And that's not the best way to do it, obviously, but that's how some have been able to build trust with subparts of different groups.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that really quickly. I think what's really important to do that I'm not confident that a lot of our institutions are currently doing is operating from what I would say an unwritten code of ethics when it comes to democracy, when it comes to trust building, and how the two are intertwined. So a constant reminder that our government is accountable to the people. That should be embedded in the operating code of ethics for everybody who's existing within that system. Or a constant reminder that questions around service, questions around decision-making, that is allowed and that should be encouraged. And that answering those questions is an act of civil duty when you exist in that institution or within that government structure. Or being transparent should be another unwritten code of ethics as it relates to building and keeping that trust from the people who enable you to be in these positions and to provide, or to even just build the institutions that exist. So I personally would like to see and to know and would have much more confidence in our institutions being able to uphold this if there was some unwritten form of code of ethics that people are operating from that upholds the core tenets of what it means to live within a democratic society. And living in a democratic society is constantly looking to earn the trust of the people who task you with doing a variety of different things as it relates to our society. So I think that's a really important thing to remember if you are a person operating within these systems, so that trust doesn't get eroded, or that trust doesn't get dampered as we move through crises, or as we move through elections, or even when we're in between elections and we're looking to ensure that people continue to be engaged and continue to have access to good information in order to make good decisions for themselves and their families.
Is it okay if I jump in real quick on that question of how to engender trust? Because it's such a central one. I think David and Brittany have laid out two really important pieces. One is sort of deliver the goods. I mean, that generally speaking, provide what you say you're going to. That's pretty critical. And we see the relationship of even like people's experiences at, getting their license renewed has an effect on how much they trust government as a whole, and even politics and political institutions. And as Brittany said, ethical conduct is obviously really central too. Another thing which, one of my sort of favorite findings when you look at the social psychology of trust is one of the ways to create trust in someone else is to behave as though you trust them. So this is sort of returning to my original point. People will trust you if they feel they're trusted by you. And just to give a more concrete example of that, we're starting to see, particularly at the local level, more use of, for example, citizens assemblies or citizens panels where you're randomly drafting a group of citizens to come in and spend a lot of time thinking and talking about an issue you want to make a decision on, and making some kind of a commitment to honor what comes out of that process. That's, on the part of political institutions, that's kind of an act of trust, right? That we're saying we trust just a random group of citizens to come in and tell us something that's really useful and insightful, and that we have to be guided by to a certain extent. And the result is this sort of reciprocal trust, is that citizens end up trusting those institutions that trust them. So something else to think about.
Except if you're the government of PEI and you do that process and then don't institute what your citizen assembly asks you to do when it comes to electoral reform, and then you get kicked out, right? So yeah, that's a great point, Mike. I think it's so important.
Right, but absolutely, if you open up the door and then slam it back in people's faces, then you have a reversal, which is worse than ever having initiated in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think we can almost start to map out, and maybe this becomes really messy, but how trust exists on this really complicated matrix of accountability, effectiveness, transparency, ethical conduct, and all of these elements that really all shape both how civic institutions trust their citizens and how our citizens can trust their civic institutions. And I want to jump off of something that you brought up, Brittany, which is how apathy is often conflated with a lack of trust. And I want to jump to what trust means for civic engagement and what we're seeing in terms of how people choose to engage and enact on their power within our democracy. And so I'm curious to hear, how does trust affect individuals' civic engagement, and what does that in turn mean for democratic institutions? And what do higher levels of trust mean for how people tend to show up in their democracy?
Can I just add some context to that really quick, and then I will leave some space for my fellow panelists. I think it's very easy maybe to talk to somebody who doesn't regularly participate in our democratic systems, and I'm just going to use elections and voting as an example, to say, I don't trust those people. They're all the same. whoever is in there is going to do what they do, they all lie, etc. Like, I mean, those are that's common rhetoric that we could hear from somebody who doesn't have a positive relationship as it relates to our democratic processes. But that's not the trust level. I just want to kind of explain the trust level that I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is the ability to rely on the systems that exist in society to do what they need to do, regardless if you participate or not. And that's a different level of trust. It's a trust that goes beyond, I would say, like or affection or agency as it relates to the system. It's a trust of the system being able to operate, whether you decide to opt in or opt out. So it's a deeper level of trust. It's a more intricate, it's a more, I would say, abstract level of trust, but that is what I'm referring to, how a lack of democratic participation doesn't always mean, or lack of trust in institution doesn't always mean apathy, but just wanted to add some context.
Thanks for clarifying that. That's really helpful that we're talking about two different, I guess the way that trust influences two different levels of trust, whether it's in being able to count on services that you need and the programs that you need to be delivered, and then also this sense of agency and political participation and civic engagement, which is another level of trust. Any comments or thoughts on what trust means? And maybe this is also a good time to ask about what this means going forward. And I think some of you have already jumped to that question about what these current, perhaps higher levels of trust mean, both for democratic institutions and for citizens going forward.
I'll jump in here and just say, I think that it's always important to remember that people are living just-in-time lives right now. And I think we've seen, especially right now, the impact that the pandemic is having on women and their careers and the choices that they're making in order to care for their families, and with all of the changes and the shifts taking place with our education system and childcare options and all of those pieces. So I think Brittany's absolutely right. There comes a point where between the action that we're taking to vote, comes into play and make a decision. But then in between, we want to be able to trust that our institutions are going to continue to work for us. And so I've really been paying a little bit of attention to how our governments create accessibility for really easy access to both consultation and ways to sort of inform government direction. And so very much in the past, it was come to us, go through a very, difficult and complicated process. It's impossible for us to make this accessible to you to participate in. There was, no ability to have these types of virtual conversations that informed committee work and things along those lines. And I think we're really seeing a shift in that. Of course, finally we can say, virtual voting is possible, and really start to break open some of what we built as traditional institutions in the past and said had to be this way, but understanding that not everybody's lives are conducive to coming to these institutions in the way that they're built. And so I think first of all, that accessibility piece has been important. And then secondly, being able to see that the time that they're putting into participating in democracy is actually, informing that work in a different way. And so I think we'll have seen very recently, especially on the education side, a lot of activism from parents and folks sort of saying we need to see a clear plan if we're putting our children in the system. What is it going to look like? And sort of putting extra time that they do not have into paying more attention and bringing their experiences forward. And so I think it's also quite important for that to be impactful in some way, for them to be able to see that the hour or two or whatever it took to participate in a consultation process actually made a difference of some sort too. So I was sort of still hoping somehow that some of the pandemic reality shifts to participation will continue afterwards, and we'll continue to sort of see that it was always needed for, say, young mothers that couldn't get out to be there at a public forum in person or something along those lines, and of course accessibility for those with disabilities or differently abled, and being able to make the effort to turn a day into being present, to show their voices and put their bodies there. And I think that I'm hopeful that this new shift of using technology to really help folks be a part of the process will continue.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just add to what Tiffany's saying, just because, I work and consult and speak to a lot of people who don't have, I would say, trust in our institutions. And when I say trust, I'm referring to the fact that they don't feel the institution is working for their best interests per se, not that it's not operating the way it's intended to operate, but the fact that it's not operating in a way that upholds their interests, or I would say acknowledges maybe the differences that exist within them, and that the institution can respond to those appropriately. And for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to get really specific. I'm going to say, I would say, Black folks across this country, I would say Indigenous folks, and then I would say racialized folks at large. But there's a different, I would say, understanding of trust when it comes to some of those people within those groups as it relates to the systems that exist. So I do want to bring in the perspective that there increasingly, from some folks, there's a belief that in order for there to be complete trust given, that these systems or these institutions need to be torn down and rebuilt back up again in order to have true trust, because they were never informed or a part of the decision making from the onset to be able to inform the direction of these institutions moving forward. So I think that's something that's really important and critical to think on, as somebody who operates from a place where I think the institutions that exist in our society, especially in our democratic systems, are extremely important. I do not think our systems or institutions are beyond reform. I think we should always be working to strengthen them. I do think it's important to acknowledge that there are some people who don't believe that strengthening our current institutions is a solution. And I do think they bring up an important part of why these institutions, or they believe these institutions are beyond reform, is because they don't feel that they were ever a part of informing these institutions to begin with. So then how do we start to think from that place where who is creating these institutions? What perspectives are driving these institutions? Who's responsible for setting the agenda? Who's responsible for picking who gets to be a part of these institutions? Who's responsible for instituting the governance models of these institutions? And I think that's really critical to building trust as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brittany and Tiffany. And I think that connects really well to a question that we've gotten from one of our participants, which is that if government institutions operate within a deficit of trust, how can they repair this broken trust with the public that they serve? And part of what you just brought up, Brittany, is how do we actually build up and design our democratic institutions, especially with folks who weren't a part of that process as they were being created. And I'm curious to hear more, or if anybody else has any thoughts on how we repair this broken trust with the public.
Well, in my mind, I think one way, particularly democratic institutions, is that you can replace the people who operate in them, right? And so I think an area, distrust persists when the system can't or doesn't allow distrustful people, or who have made decisions that people that have lost trust. It doesn't replace them, or doesn't allow for that replacement to happen. And so I think that's a starting point, that people need to believe in that's where you tie trust, I think, to participation, right? It's so I can trust that the institutions will ultimately serve my interests as long as I participate. And if I participate, it's because my actions will change something, right? If we continue to see, a government led by individuals who break trust, and there is no consequence for that, that's where you, I think, start to see a real decline in trust. And I think over the last number of years, we've seen it rising participation, at least at the federal level, in part because I think there's been change and accountability in the system itself, where it wasn't there for a long time. I think of the 90s as an example, where you had the government continually get elected because a certain portion of the electorate felt that they could never replace the liberals federally because the right was, quote, divided, right? So that's just an example of that will break down the trust, because the system itself is not allowing people to see the change that they're hoping to see.
That's a great point, and I think I think it was Tiffany who made the point earlier that we trust people, not institutions, and Brittany made the point that we tend to trust people who we feel some closeness with on some level, and that's definitely true in the research. And so yeah, I think that's a really critical insight. The way democracy works is you're not always going to be represented by the person you most want to represent you. You usually lose, right? and you have to be willing to stick with it. So what's important, I think, is just feeling ownership. And we're starting to think about how to create opportunities for people to feel greater ownership. Again, talking specifically about democratic institutions, greater ownership of their representatives, even if they don't align on partisan and ideological grounds or whatever. One thing that we think about a lot is how people wind up on a ballot, nominations, right? Which in this country is very rarely an open, inclusive, participatory, democratic process at the community level. So we're looking at ways to move, like step back from the institutions themselves, step back from the sort of the outcome, which is the institution and the people who are in it, and think about how to give people greater ownership of the inputs, like what goes into the system, so that they can feel, like they have greater stakes in the institution ultimately. And so even when they're not getting the exact decisions they want and so on, they still sort of feel like that's mine. I played a role in this. So I think it's important that we broaden those opportunities for participation, extend a little greater ownership, find new ways to do that.
Yeah. And I want to make sure we get through a few of these audience questions before we have to end off in a few minutes. I think we've been talking a lot about trust in civic institutions and between civic institutions and individuals, and haven't touched as much on who all the other players are in our system and in our decision-making processes. And we have one question asking, are politicians not willing to trust voters, or are they more influenced by lobbyists and individual biases when making decisions? How can we break those influences? And maybe I'll also add on to that question in terms of what those other influences or the influences of other players within our decision-making systems mean for trust, either trust in civic institutions or trust in the public.
I think go for it, Mike.
Oh no, please go ahead.
I was going to say really quickly, I think it's a really important question to acknowledge that lobbyists do have a disproportionate amount of power as it relates to access to government and decision makers, and I would even say having their desired outcomes being reflected in policy decisions or budget decisions. So I would say for people who are really interested in achieving more balance or having the public have a greater say, is, I would say, really dedicating time to looking at those who operate in civil society. So I would say whether there's some think tanks that operate in civic society, there's some organizations who work to amplify the public's voice as it relates to government. There's also, activism is essentially a way to help balance out or public forms of activism, whether that's protests, whether that's advocacy campaigns, whether that's organizing individuals around a central message to apply pressure. So I think it's really looking to external ways to apply political pressure. And most importantly, again, I'm a very firm believer in participation during elections. I think that's really critical, but to ensure high participation rates during elections, you need to ensure that you're engaging the public in between elections, so that people are just not clueless, or not even not clueless, but don't feel as empowered or feel a strong sense of ability to participate when that moment comes to cast their vote. So I think looking to external ways to apply pressure and forms of accountability, I think is really, really critical to balancing out the high levels of power and influence that that lobbyists have when it comes to decisions in society.
I mean, one of the things we've seen in our tracking over the last few months from a public opinion perspective is first, there's been a rise in the number of Canadians who say that decisions by governments should be driven by experts as opposed to the will of the public, right? And it's not a perfect dichotomy. I think you can do both. You can listen to the public and be informed from policy from those who are experts on it. But I think the pandemic provides a case study where governments that have been guided by health experts, epidemiologists, public health, have done better. They have more trust because people feel that those decisions are guided by their best interests as opposed to someone else's interest. And so to Brittany's point, I do think that you get into trouble, you lose trust with the public when the public feels that organizations or interests that they don't trust are the ones guiding the decisions. And we've seen clearly that Canadians trust Dr. Tam. They trust far more than they trust the political leaders, but they appreciate that the political leaders are listening to her. And I think so the case, the pandemic really provides that case for the value of expert opinion, even at a time where populism might be pushing those experts out, or there's a desire to see them less influential.
Did anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'll just say very quickly, because I know we're running low on time. I think something Brittany brought up was quite important, and it's around think tanks and how they're funded. And I think we've definitely reached a point sort of pre this crisis where a lot of those institutions have lost funding, and especially government funding that was keeping them sustainable in their operations. And so I think to the ability to have far-sighted planning and be really pulling together the best policy, it's required that we have folks like that are doing that work. And so I think there's a true need to ensure that they're well-funded and healthy to be able to bring those perspectives to the table.
Thanks, Tiffany. And we're pretty much right at time here. So it is time to wrap up. But first, I wanted to thank each of the four of you for painting a full picture of trust and democracy. And I think each of you brought in such an important perspective in shaping that conversation and bringing about some of the nuance in what we're talking about. And so really appreciate the four of you and your time, and to everyone for tuning in as well, and wishing everyone a great rest of your sessions in this week in our Democracy Exchange Festival, and wish you all the best in your day.